I pulled into my driveway after a grueling 10-hour shift, pouring concrete my work boots, caked with dried cement, and my back aching from hauling rebar all day. What I saw made my blood freeze solid. A bright red "Sold" sign jutted from my front lawn like a dagger through my heart, while uniformed movers carried my mother's antique dining table toward a waiting truck. My stepfather Gerald emerged from the house designer suitcase in hand, wearing a smile that could cut glass. He glanced at me with casual indifference and shrugged his shoulders. "You don't need a luxury home at your age?" he said, his voice dripping with mock concern. My mind raced as I processed the impossible scene unfolding before me. This had to be some kind of nightmare, the kind where you wake up gasping and realize none of it was real. But the rumble of diesel engines and the scrape of furniture against hardwood floors told me otherwise. I stumbled out of my pickup truck, nearly tripping over my own feet as adrenaline coursed through my veins. Gerald stood on the front porch of my childhood home, the house where my mother Emma had raised me after my father died in a factory accident when I was 7 years old. This was the same porch where she used to read me bedtime stories on summer evenings, where we carved pumpkins every October, where she taught me to tie my shoes and ride a bicycle. Gerald, what the hell is happening here? I demanded, my voice cracking despite my efforts to sound strong. The movers paused in their work, sensing the tension crackling in the air like electricity before a thunderstorm. He reached into his jacket pocket and produced a manila folder thick with legal documents. His manicured fingernails caught the afternoon sunlight as he flipped through the papers with practiced ease. "Oh, Brian, you signed the power of attorney paperwork 6 months ago, remember? Right after poor Emma's funeral, when you were so devastated you could barely think straight." The memory hit me like a sledgehammer to the chest. I remembered sitting in the funeral director's office, my eyes swollen from crying, while Gerald shuffled papers in front of me. I had signed dozens of documents that day without reading them, trusting the man my mother had married when I was 15 years old. At the time, Gerald had seemed genuinely concerned about my emotional state, offering to handle all the complicated legal matters while I grieved. Now I realized how naive I had been. Gerald's thin lips curled into what he probably thought was a sympathetic smile. "The house was put in both our names when your mother and I married Brian. As her widower, I have every right to make decisions about our shared property. You're 28 years old, for crying out loud. You should be living in an apartment like other young men your age, not rattling around in this big old place like some kind of hermit." I watched in horror as the movers emerged from the house, carrying my mother's china cabinet, the one that had belonged to her grandmother. 3 generations of family memories were being loaded onto a truck like common freight. My throat tightened until I could barely breathe. "But this is my home," I whispered, hating how weak and desperate I sounded. "Mom left this place to me. She always said it would be mine someday." Gerald's expression shifted from fake concern to open contempt. "Your mother said a lot of things, but legal documents don't lie. Besides, I've already spent half the proceeds on a very expensive European vacation. 3 weeks in Paris, Rome, and Barcelona. First-class flights, 5-star hotels, the works. I've been planning this trip for months, and I'm not about to cancel it now because you're having second thoughts about our arrangement." He gestured toward the moving truck with obvious satisfaction. "The buyer paid cash, Brian, $250,000 for this old place. Not bad for a house that needs a new roof and probably has asbestos in the basement. I've already transferred the money to accounts where it'll do some real good instead of just sitting around collecting dust like everything else in this mausoleum." Just then, Sarah's Honda Civic pulled into the driveway behind my truck. My girlfriend stepped out, her scrubs still wrinkled from her 12-hour shift at the hospital, where she worked as a registered nurse. She took one look at the scene and her face went pale. "Brian, what's going on here?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Gerald answered before I could find my voice. "Brian's finally growing up and moving on with his life. This house was keeping him trapped in the past, living like a child instead of becoming a man. Sometimes we all need a little push to do what's best for us. Sarah moved closer to me, her presence providing the only comfort I could find in the chaos surrounding us. She had been coming to this house for 2 years, sharing Sunday dinners at my mother's table, helping me plant tomatoes, in the back garden, curling up with me on the living room couch to watch old movies. This place meant something to her, too. Gerald glanced at his expensive watch and sighed dramatically. Well, this has been touching, but I have a flight to catch tomorrow morning. The movers need to finish up before dark, and I still have packing to do. He turned on his heel and disappeared back into the house, leaving Sarah and me standing in the driveway like survivors of some natural disaster. The moving truck's engine rumbled ominously as workers continued loading my life into cardboard boxes and plastic wrap. The worst part wasn't just losing the house, it was the casual way Gerald had dismissed my mother's memory, calling her home a mausoleum and treating our family treasures like unwanted junk. He had shown no respect for the woman who had loved him, supported him, and ultimately trusted him with everything she owned. As I watched strangers carry away my mother's rocking chair, the one where she used to sit and knit scarves for the church charity drive every winter, I felt something break inside my chest. It wasn't just my heart. It was my faith in justice in family, in the belief that good people who work hard and follow the rules will somehow be protected from predators who see kindness as weakness. But underneath that crushing disappointment, something else began to stir. A cold, calculating anger that told me this wasn't over. Gerald might have won this battle, but he had underestimated the son of Emma Walsh. My mother had raised me to be honest and trusting, but she had also raised me to be strong. Gerald was about to learn the difference between those two things. 24 hours later, I sat in attorney Marcus Webb's cramped office above the hardware store on Main Street, clutching the suspicious documents that had turned my world upside down. Coffee stains marked the edges of his desk, and law books towered in precarious stacks around the small room, like paper skyscrapers threatening to topple at any moment. Webb adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and studied the power of attorney papers under a magnifying lamp. His weathered face creased with concentration. He had been practicing law in our small Illinois town for 37 years, handling everything from property disputes to divorce cases, and his experience showed in the careful way he examined each page. "Brian, I have to be honest with you," he said, setting the documents down with a heavy sigh. "These signatures don't look quite right to me. The slant is different from your usual handwriting, and the pressure seems inconsistent. But proving forgery in court is a completely different animal than spotting it with the naked eye." My stomach dropped as he continued explaining the brutal reality of my situation. "Even if we can prove these documents were forged, which would require expensive handwriting analysis and possibly months of legal proceedings reversing the sale, becomes incredibly complicated once money has changed hands and been transferred to offshore accounts." Webb leaned back in his creaky leather chair and folded his hands across his stomach. "The legal fees alone could run you $15,000 to $20,000, assuming we can build a strong enough case to convince a judge. And that's not counting the time factor. Gerald could be living it up in Europe for years before we see the inside of a courtroom." Sarah squeezed my hand as we absorbed this devastating news. She had taken a personal day from the hospital to come with me, and her presence kept me anchored when everything else felt like it was spinning out of control. "There has to be something we can do," she said, her voice steady despite the circumstances. "This man has basically stolen Brian's inheritance and is planning to spend it on vacation. That can't be legal." Webb nodded sympathetically, but his expression remained grim. "I'm not saying it's impossible, just expensive and time-consuming. Gerald seems to have planned this very carefully. He waited until Brian was emotionally vulnerable, used legitimate-looking documents, and worked with a real estate company that followed standard procedures. From their perspective, everything appeared legal and above board. After leaving the attorney's office, Sarah suggested we start gathering evidence on our own. We drove to First National Bank, where my mother had done business for over 20 years, and asked to speak with the security manager about reviewing surveillance footage from the past few months. Tom Patterson, the security manager, had known my family since I was in elementary school. He agreed to help us review the recordings, and what we found made my blood boil with rage. There was Gerald, clear as day, standing at my mother's old safety deposit box, just 3 weeks after her funeral, removing documents and replacing them with others he had brought in a briefcase. The footage showed him making multiple visits to the bank, always during business hours, when I would be at work, always carrying the same black leather briefcase. In one particularly damning clip, we watched him practice signing my name on a piece of scrap paper before filling out official withdrawal forms. Tom agreed to preserve the footage and provide copies for our legal case, but warned us that even video evidence might not be enough to reverse completed financial transactions, especially ones involving international transfers. Our next stop was my mother's longtime neighbor, Dorothy Martinez, who had lived next door for 18 years and considered my mother one of her closest friends. Dorothy invited us into her kitchen, where the aroma of fresh baked bread filled the air, and family photos covered every available surface. "Brian, I'm so glad you came to see me," Dorothy said, her kind eyes filled with concern. "I've been worried sick about what's been happening at your place. There were strange men surveying the house weeks before your mother passed away, taking measurements and photographs. I thought it was odd, but Gerald told me they were insurance adjusters updating the policy." She disappeared into her bedroom and returned with a small digital camera. "I took pictures of those men because something didn't feel right about the whole situation. Look here, you can see Gerald talking to them on the front lawn, pointing at different parts of the house and showing them papers from a folder. The photographs were exactly the evidence we needed to prove Gerald had been planning this scheme long before my mother's death. The timestamps showed the men visiting the property repeatedly over a 2-month period, always when my mother was at her weekly chemotherapy treatments, and I was working late shifts at the construction site." Dorothy's voice dropped to an angry whisper as she shared more disturbing information. "Gerald started collecting your mail about 6 weeks ago, claiming he wanted to spare you the stress of dealing with legal documents while your mother was so sick. I saw him taking envelopes from your mailbox several times, but I didn't want to interfere in family business." We drove to Henderson Real Estate, the company that had handled the sale, and requested a meeting with the agent who had worked with Gerald. Julie Chen, a petite woman in her 40s, with short black hair and nervous energy, agreed to speak with us in her office. Julie shifted uncomfortably in her chair as we explained our situation. She admitted that Gerald's urgency about the sale had seemed unusual, but all his paperwork appeared legitimate, and he had power of attorney documentation that gave him legal authority to act on my behalf. "He told me you were struggling with depression and substance abuse after your mother's death?" Julie confessed, her cheeks flushing with embarrassment. "He said you weren't capable of making rational decisions about the property, and that selling quickly was the kindest thing for everyone involved. He seemed so concerned about your well-being that I believed him completely. Gerald had painted me as an unstable young man who needed protection from his own poor judgment. He had used my grief as a weapon against me, convincing everyone around me that his betrayal was actually an act of compassion." But the most shocking revelation came when Julie showed us copies of the financial documents Gerald had provided. Not only had he forged my signature on the power of attorney papers, but he had also created fake bank statements showing that I owed massive debts to credit card companies and had taken out loans against the house that didn't actually exist. The scope of Gerald's deception was breathtaking. He had constructed an elaborate fictional narrative about my financial irresponsibility to justify selling my inheritance and pocketing the proceeds. Every lie had been carefully crafted to make his theft seem like responsible financial management. As we drove home that evening, Sarah and I sat in stunned silence, processing everything we had learned. Gerald wasn't just an opportunistic stepfather who had taken advantage of my grief. He was a sophisticated criminal who had spent months planning every detail of his scheme. The realization was both terrifying and oddly comforting. If Gerald was this calculating and methodical, it meant he had probably made mistakes somewhere along the way. Criminals who think they're smarter than everyone else often get sloppy because they become overconfident. I pulled into the parking lot of the motel where Sarah and I had been staying since losing the house and made a decision that would change everything. Instead of continuing to react to Gerald's moves, I was going to start making some moves of my own. Gerald thought he had gotten away with the perfect crime, but he had underestimated one crucial factor. I might have been naive and trusting, but I was also my mother's son. And Emma Walsh had taught me that sometimes the only way to deal with a bully is to stand up and fight back harder than they expect. The game was just beginning. 3 days before Gerald's scheduled departure, I made a decision that surprised everyone, including myself. Instead of continuing to fight his travel plans or begging him to reconsider, I decided to let him leave exactly as he had planned. Sometimes the best strategy is to give your enemy exactly what they think they want. I showed up at Gerald's temporary apartment across town, carrying a bottle of expensive wine and wearing my most defeated expression. He answered the door wearing silk pajamas and a look of smug satisfaction that made my skin crawl. "Gerald," I said, forcing my voice to sound broken and resigned. "I've been thinking about what you said. Maybe you're right. Maybe I was being selfish, trying to hold on to that old house. Mom always wanted me to grow up and become independent." His eyes lit up with triumph as he invited me inside. The apartment was littered with designer luggage, European guidebooks, and first-class airline tickets. He had clearly spared no expense preparing for his victory celebration. "I'm glad you're finally seeing reason, Brian," he said, pouring himself a glass of the wine I had brought. "This trip will be good for both of us. You'll learn to stand on your own 2 feet, and I'll get to honor your mother's memory by experiencing the culture and art she always dreamed of seeing." The casual way he invoked my mother's name while bragging about spending her money made me want to punch him in his smirking face. Instead, I nodded and played the role of a beaten man accepting his fate. While Gerald rambled about his planned itinerary, I excused myself to use the bathroom and quickly planted a small GPS tracking device inside the lining of his largest suitcase. The device, purchased from an online surveillance supply company, was roughly the size of a quarter and would transmit his location data for up to 30 days. My construction crew had rallied around me in ways that made my throat tight with gratitude. Jake Morrison, our lead electrician, had a cousin who worked for an international fraud investigation unit with the FBI. Tommy Rodriguez, our concrete foreman, had connections with a private investigator who specialized in tracking financial crimes across state and international borders. The private investigator Tony Martinez agreed to work with us for a reduced rate after hearing the details of Gerald's scheme. Tony was a former police detective who had retired early after being injured in a car accident, and he understood the importance of pursuing justice even when the legal system moved too slowly to provide immediate relief. Sarah had been researching Gerald's background using social media and public records databases, and what she discovered chilled us both to the bone. Gerald had been married 3 times before meeting my mother, and in each case, his previous wives had died under mysterious circumstances that left him as the sole beneficiary of their life insurance policies and estate assets. The pattern was always the same. Gerald would marry older women who had adult children from previous marriages, gradually isolate them from their families, and then benefit financially when they passed away. My mother hadn't been his first victim, she had been his 4th. During our fake reconciliation dinner at a chain restaurant near the airport, I maintained my defeated facade while secretly studying Gerald's behavior for signs of weakness or overconfidence. He bragged about having multiple credit cards under variations of his name, boasted about his skill at manipulating financial institutions, and even joked about how easy it had been to fool the real estate agents and bank officials. "Gerald, you're obviously much smarter than I gave you credit for," I said, swallowing my rage and forcing admiration into my voice. "How did you learn to handle all these complicated financial arrangements?" He leaned across the table with the satisfied expression of a man who enjoyed explaining his own cleverness. "Brian, most people are sheep who follow rules without thinking. But successful people understand that rules are just suggestions for those smart enough to work around them. Your mother was a sweet woman, but she was naive about money and business. She needed someone with vision to help her assets reach their full potential." I nodded as if his words made perfect sense while mentally recording every detail of his confession for later use. Gerald was so proud of his scheme that he couldn't resist bragging about it, especially to someone he believed was too weak and stupid to pose any threat. The next morning, I drove Gerald to O'Hare Airport and even helped him check his luggage, including the suitcase containing the GPS tracking device. He shook my hand at the security checkpoint and told me he hoped I would use this experience as motivation to build a better life for myself. As I watched him disappear through the security gates, wheeling his expensive luggage and radiating confidence, I felt a strange sense of calm settle over my chest. Gerald thought he was escaping to enjoy the fruits of his criminal labor, but he was actually walking directly into a carefully prepared trap. Within hours of his departure, Tony began sending me regular updates about Gerald's location and activities. The GPS device showed his arrival in Paris, his taxi ride to the Georges V Hotel, and his evening stroll along the Champs-Élysées. Every movement was being tracked and recorded. But the real surprise came when I opened the safety deposit box my mother had rented under her maiden name, something Gerald apparently hadn't discovered during his extensive research. Inside, I found a handwritten video will that my mother had recorded just weeks before her death, along with detailed financial records showing that she had suspected Gerald's true nature and had taken steps to protect her assets. The video will properly witnessed and notarized specifically disinherited Gerald and left everything to me. It also contained my mother's suspicions about Gerald's involvement in her illness, suggesting that her rapid decline might not have been entirely natural. As I watched my mother's image on the laptop screen explaining her fears about Gerald and her desire to protect me from his manipulations, tears streamed down my face. She had known. Somehow, even while battling cancer and trusting Gerald with daily care, she had seen through his facade and tried to leave me the tools I would need to fight back. Mom's voice was weak but determined as she spoke directly to the camera. "Brian, if you're watching this, it means something has happened to me, and Gerald has tried to steal your inheritance. Don't let him win, sweetheart. You're stronger than you know, and you have more friends than you realize. Fight for what's right and remember that I will always be proud of you." The video will was exactly the legal ammunition I needed to challenge Gerald's actions, but more importantly, it was proof that my mother's love and wisdom extended beyond her death. She had anticipated Gerald's betrayal and given me a roadmap for defeating him. Gerald was enjoying his first week in Paris, completely unaware that his every move was being monitored and that his elaborate scheme was beginning to unravel. He had planned this trip as a celebration of his criminal success, but it was actually going to become the evidence that destroyed him. Sometimes justice comes slowly, but it comes completely. Gerald's first week in Europe coincided perfectly with my evidence-gathering operation reaching its crucial phase. While he strolled through the Louvre and dined at expensive restaurants along the Seine, completely oblivious to the net closing around him, Tony Martinez was documenting his every movement and expenditure. The GPS tracking device provided precise location data, but Tony's investigation had uncovered something far more interesting than Gerald's tourist activities. The financial contacts Gerald had arranged to meet in Europe weren't just money managers or investment advisors. They were suspected members of an international fraud network that specialized in helping American criminals hide stolen assets in European banks. Jake's cousin, Special Agent Rebecca Sullivan, from the FBI's International Financial Crimes Division, agreed to meet with us at a coffee shop in downtown Chicago. Rebecca was a sharp-eyed woman in her early 40s who had spent 15 years tracking financial criminals across multiple continents. Brian, what you've described sounds exactly like a pattern we've been investigating for over 2 years, she said, reviewing the evidence we had compiled. These networks typically target middle-aged men who prey on older women, then use sophisticated money laundering operations to hide the proceeds overseas. Rebecca explained that Gerald's European contacts were likely part of a larger criminal organization that provided services to fraud perpetrators throughout the United States. By connecting with this network, Gerald had unknowingly exposed himself to federal investigation and international law enforcement cooperation. The timing couldn't have been better. Rebecca's task force had been working with Europol and Interpol to identify and arrest members of these fraud networks, and Gerald's activities in Paris had attracted the attention of French financial crime investigators. Sarah had continued her social media research and discovered that Gerald was posting photos of his European vacation on multiple platforms, apparently unable to resist bragging about his luxurious lifestyle. The photos showed him at the Ritz Hotel shopping at Louis Vuitton and dining at Michelin-starred restaurants, all while making mocking comments about naive Americans who don't understand how the world really works. One particularly infuriating post showed Gerald raising a champagne glass toward the camera with the caption, "To Emma, who taught me that trust is the most valuable currency of all. Some lessons are worth more than others." But Gerald's social media arrogance was providing valuable evidence for our case. Each post included location data and timestamps that correlated perfectly with our GPS tracking information, creating a detailed record of his activities and expenditures. Tony had also discovered that Gerald's spending patterns in Europe matched the exact amount of money he had received from selling my house. The hotel bills, restaurant charges, and shopping expenses were being paid with credit cards that trace back to the offshore accounts where he had hidden the proceeds from his theft. Attorney Webb had been working with Rebecca to file federal charges for wire fraud, money laundering, and elder abuse. The interstate nature of Gerald's crimes combined with his international financial activities brought the case under federal jurisdiction and triggered cooperation agreements with European law enforcement agencies. Meanwhile, Dorothy Martinez had been conducting her own investigation in our neighborhood. She had spoken with other longtime residents and discovered that Gerald had been asking suspicious questions about elderly homeowners who lived alone, apparently scouting for potential future victims. Mrs. Peterson, who lived 3 blocks away, told Dorothy that Gerald had offered to help her with financial planning just months before my mother's death. Mr. Thompson, a widower in his 70s, said Gerald had approached him about selling his house and moving to a retirement community. The pattern was becoming clear. Gerald hadn't just targeted my mother randomly. He had been systematically identifying vulnerable, older adults in our community and positioning himself to exploit them financially. But the most shocking discovery came when Rebecca's investigation revealed that Gerald had used similar schemes in at least 3 other states over the past decade. The FBI had files on him under several different aliases, connecting him to the suspicious deaths of multiple elderly women and the subsequent disappearance of their assets. Rebecca called me with an update that made my hands shake with excitement and rage. "Brian, we've been trying to build a case against this guy for years, but his previous victims' families either didn't have enough evidence or were too intimidated to pursue prosecution. Your mother's video will, and the documentation you provided, might be the key to bringing down his entire operation." Gerald's European activities had triggered automatic alerts in international financial monitoring systems designed to detect money laundering and fraud. French authorities were now tracking his movements and preparing to coordinate with American law enforcement agencies for his eventual arrest. The irony was perfect. Gerald had planned his European vacation as a celebration of his criminal success, but his spending spree was actually providing law enforcement with detailed evidence of his financial crimes. Every expensive meal and luxury purchase was being documented as proof of his theft, Sarah and I drove to the house that Gerald had stolen from me, which was now sitting empty while the buyers completed their financing arrangements. Standing in the driveway where this nightmare had begun, I felt a strange sense of peace settling over my chest. My mother's garden was overgrown with weeds, and paint was beginning to peel from the shutters she had painted just last spring. But the house itself looked solid and patient, as if it was waiting for me to reclaim it. I knew that Gerald's arrest was imminent, and that the legal process would eventually restore my inheritance and bring justice for my mother's memory. But more importantly, I had learned something valuable about myself during this ordeal. I wasn't the naive, helpless young man Gerald had tried to convince everyone I was. I was Emma Walsh's son, raised with her values of honesty and determination, but also equipped with the strength and intelligence needed to fight back against those who mistake kindness for weakness. Gerald was about to learn that some lessons are indeed worth more than others, just not in the way he had intended. Gerald's second week in Europe marked the beginning of his downfall, though he remained blissfully unaware as his lavish lifestyle began attracting exactly the kind of attention he should have been avoiding. While he posted photos of himself at the Colosseum in Rome, boasting about his first-class accommodations and expensive dining experiences, international law enforcement agencies were coordinating the operation that would bring his criminal career to a spectacular end. The turning point came on a Tuesday evening at an exclusive restaurant near the Spanish Steps, where Gerald had arranged to meet with his European financial contacts. What he didn't realize was that these contacts had been under surveillance by Italian financial crime investigators for over 6 months as part of a joint operation with American federal agencies. Tony Martinez called me with an update that made my heart race with anticipation. "Brian, our boy, just walked into a trap that's been 18 months in the making. The Italians have been building cases against this entire network, and Gerald's activities have provided them with exactly the evidence they needed to move forward with arrests." Rebecca Sullivan had coordinated with her European counterparts to ensure that Gerald's detention would provide maximum benefit for all the ongoing investigations. His financial records, electronic communications, and travel documents would become crucial evidence in prosecuting the international fraud network that had been operating across multiple countries. But Gerald's problems were just beginning. On Wednesday morning, his American Express card was declined at the Hotel de Russie when he tried to extend his stay in Rome. The bank informed him that his accounts had been frozen, pending investigation of suspicious financial activities. Gerald immediately called the bank's customer service line, and Tony's contacts in the financial industry provided us with recordings of those conversations. Gerald's voice progressed from confident irritation to panicked desperation as customer service representatives explained that federal authorities had issued seizure orders for all accounts connected to his social security number and passport information. "You don't understand," Gerald argued with the bank representative, his voice cracking with stress. "I'm a legitimate businessman on vacation in Europe. This must be some kind of mistake or identity theft situation." But the bank's fraud prevention systems had been triggered by alerts from American law enforcement agencies, and no amount of arguing could reverse the account freezers. Gerald found himself stranded in one of Europe's most expensive cities, with declining credit cards and rapidly dwindling cash reserves. Meanwhile, Rebecca's team had obtained warrants to search Gerald's apartment and the storage unit where he had hidden additional evidence of his crimes. What they discovered exceeded even our most optimistic expectations. Gerald had kept detailed records of his previous schemes, apparently as trophies of his criminal success. File cabinets contained forged documents, copies of death certificates, and financial records showing how he had systematically looted the estates of multiple elderly women over the past decade. Most damaging of all, they found Gerald's personal journal, where he had written detailed accounts of his methods and motivations. In his own handwriting, he described my mother as his easiest mark yet, and bragged about how simple it had been to manipulate her emotional attachment to him. One particularly disturbing journal entry read Emma was so grateful to have someone take care of the complicated financial matters after her diagnosis. She signed whatever I put in front of her without reading it, trusting me completely because she thought love meant never questioning your partner's judgment. Her son is just as naive, which makes this the perfect setup for a clean exit with maximum profit. Sarah had to leave the room when Rebecca read that passage aloud during our briefing. The casual cruelty of Gerald's words, describing my mother's trust as weakness and her love as stupidity, revealed the true depth of his sociopathic personality. But Gerald's journal also provided detailed confessions to crimes that investigators hadn't even discovered yet. He had documented insurance fraud, tax evasion, and identity theft spanning multiple states and involving dozens of victims. Rebecca smiled grimly as she explained the implications. Brian, this journal is like winning the lottery for federal prosecutors. Gerald has basically provided us with a complete roadmap of his criminal activities, including details that would have taken us years to uncover through traditional investigation methods. Gerald's European contacts were arrested simultaneously in coordinated raids across 3 countries. The timing was crucial because it prevented them from warning Gerald about the investigation and gave authorities access to communication records that implicated him in the broader conspiracy. When Gerald's hotel bill came due on Friday morning, he discovered that his remaining credit cards had also been frozen. Hotel security escorted him to the lobby where he tried desperately to contact American Consular Services for assistance. Tony's GPS tracking device showed Gerald moving frantically between internet cafes and embassy offices, apparently trying to understand why his financial empire had collapsed so suddenly. His social media posts from this period showed a dramatic shift from arrogant bragging to confused panic. Gerald's most recent post read, "Experiencing some technical difficulties with international banking systems." These European financial institutions are incredibly inefficient compared to American standards. We'll be resolving these minor issues shortly and continuing my cultural exploration tour. But behind the false bravado, Gerald was beginning to realize that his situation was far more serious than a simple banking error. When he attempted to book an earlier return flight to the United States airport, security flagged his passport and informed him that American authorities had requested notification of any travel plans. Rebecca called me with the news I had been waiting to hear for weeks. Brian, Italian authorities arrested Gerald this morning at Rome's Fiumicino airport. He was attempting to board a flight to Morocco using a fake passport, which adds federal charges for passport fraud to his already impressive list of crimes. The arrest footage captured by airport security cameras showed Gerald being detained by Italian police while protesting his innocence and demanding to speak with American embassy officials. His expensive luggage and designer clothing couldn't disguise the fact that he was now facing decades in federal prison. Sarah and I celebrated that evening by visiting my mother's grave and sharing the news of Gerald's arrest. Standing beside her headstone, I felt a sense of completion that I hadn't experienced since her death. Justice wasn't just an abstract concept anymore. It was a concrete reality that honored her memory and validated the values she had taught me. The house that Gerald had stolen was about to be returned to me through emergency court orders, but more importantly, his arrest would prevent him from victimizing other families the way he had victimized mine. My mother had raised me to believe that good things happen to people who work hard and treat others with kindness. Gerald's arrest proved that she was right even when the timeline for justice extends longer than anyone wants to wait. Sometimes the best revenge is simply allowing criminals to destroy themselves through their own greed and arrogance. Gerald's third week abroad transformed from a luxury vacation into a legal nightmare that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The Italian authorities had moved swiftly after his arrest at Fiumicino Airport, and his attempts to portray himself as an innocent American tourist fell apart under even basic scrutiny. Rebecca Sullivan flew to Rome to coordinate Gerald's extradition proceedings, and she called me with updates that felt like chapters from a crime thriller novel. Gerald was being held in Regina Coeli Prison, one of Italy's most notorious detention facilities, while prosecutors from both countries worked to untangle the web of international financial crimes he had committed. Brian, you should see the evidence room they've set up for this case, Rebecca told me during one of our conversations. Gerald kept records of everything, apparently believing he was too smart to ever get caught. We have documentation of fraud schemes going back 12 years, involving over 40 elderly victims across 8 different states. The scope of Gerald's criminal enterprise was staggering. He had refined his methods over more than a decade, learning from each successful theft and developing increasingly sophisticated techniques for exploiting vulnerable older adults. My mother hadn't been his first victim or his last intended target, but Gerald's meticulous record-keeping, which he had probably intended as proof of his criminal genius, became the evidence that guaranteed his conviction on multiple felony charges. Federal prosecutors were building cases for wire fraud, money laundering, elder abuse conspiracy, and racketeering that would result in consecutive prison sentences totaling decades. Meanwhile, the emergency court order I had requested was approved by a federal judge who reviewed my mother's video will and the evidence of Gerald's forgery. The house sale was declared fraudulent and reversed, with all proceeds being returned to my legal ownership pending the completion of Gerald's criminal trial. Sarah and I drove to the house on a sunny Thursday morning in late October, carrying the keys that a federal marshal had personally delivered to my motel room. Walking through the front door felt like stepping back into a life that had been stolen from me, then miraculously restored through persistence and the support of people who believed in justice. My construction crew had volunteered their time to help restore the house to its original condition. Jake rewired the electrical system that Gerald had damaged during his hasty packing process. Tommy repaired the hardwood floors that had been scratched by the moving equipment. Danny repainted the living room walls where Gerald had removed family photographs and left nail holes. But the most meaningful restoration work happened when Dorothy Martinez helped me replant my mother's garden, using seeds and bulbs that she had saved from the previous growing season. Working in the soil where my mother had spent countless hours nurturing flowers and vegetables gave me a sense of connection to her memory that Gerald's theft had temporarily severed. The legal proceedings moved forward with impressive speed, partly because Gerald's own documentation made prosecution relatively straightforward. His journal entries provided detailed confessions to crimes that investigators hadn't even suspected, and his financial records traced stolen money through international accounts with precision that would have impressed forensic accountants. Gerald's public defender attempted to negotiate plea agreements, but federal prosecutors were determined to use his case as an example that would deter other potential financial predators. The charges carried maximum sentences that would keep Gerald in federal prison until he was well into his 80s. More importantly, other victims of Gerald's schemes began coming forward as news of his arrest spread through law enforcement databases. Families from Oregon, Florida, and Texas contacted Rebecca's task force with similar stories of elderly relatives who had been financially exploited by a charming man who matched Gerald's description and methods. Each new victim strengthened the federal case and added additional charges to Gerald's growing list of criminal counts. What had started as my personal quest for justice was becoming a comprehensive effort to hold Gerald accountable for decades of predatory behavior. The breakthrough moment came when Italian investigators discovered that Gerald's European financial contacts were part of an international money laundering network that had processed stolen funds for hundreds of American criminals. Gerald's case became the cornerstone of a massive international prosecution effort involving law enforcement agencies from 6 different countries. Rebecca called me with news that made my hands tremble with excitement. Brian, this investigation has uncovered one of the largest international fraud networks we've ever seen. Gerald's arrest is going to result in the prosecution of over 60 criminals across multiple continents. Your mother's case has become the foundation for bringing down an entire criminal organization. But perhaps the most satisfying moment came when I received a phone call from Gerald himself, calling from his Italian prison cell in a desperate attempt to negotiate some kind of deal. His voice had lost all traces of the arrogant confidence he had displayed while stealing my inheritance. Brian, I think there's been some kind of misunderstanding about our family situation. Gerald said his words carefully chosen to avoid admitting guilt while still appealing for sympathy. Your mother and I had an understanding about financial arrangements, and perhaps I moved too quickly in implementing her wishes. I'm sure we can work something out that benefits everyone involved. I listened to his pathetic attempt at manipulation with cold satisfaction, remembering how he had dismissed my emotional pleas while loading my mother's furniture onto a moving truck. The power dynamic had shifted completely, and Gerald was now the one begging for mercy from someone he had underestimated. Gerald, I said, keeping my voice calm and professional, you made your choices when you decided to steal my mother's house and mock her memory. Now, you get to live with the consequences of those choices. I hope your European vacation was worth spending the rest of your life in federal prison. I hung up before he could respond, feeling a sense of closure that I hadn't expected. Gerald's criminal career was over, his stolen money had been recovered and returned to his victims, and his arrest had prevented him from targeting other families the way he had targeted mine. The house felt different now, filled with the presence of friends who had helped me fight back against injustice and reclaim what was rightfully mine. My mother's memory was no longer shadowed by Gerald's theft and mockery. Instead, it was honored by the community of people who had rallied around me when everything seemed hopeless. Justice had been served not through violence or revenge, but through patience, persistence, and the systematic application of legal consequences to criminal behavior. Gerald would spend the rest of his life paying for his crimes, while I would spend the rest of mine building something positive from the ashes of his destruction. Sometimes the best victories are the ones that restore what was stolen, rather than simply punishing those who took it. 6 months later, I stood in the fully restored living room of my family home, surrounded by the warmth of community and the satisfaction that comes from seeing justice transform pain into purpose. The late spring sunlight streamed through windows that my mother had washed just weeks before her death, illuminating photographs and memories that Gerald had tried to erase but could never truly destroy. Gerald's sentencing hearing had concluded the previous month, with the judge delivering consecutive prison terms totaling 37 years in federal prison. At 62 years old, Gerald would likely spend the remainder of his life behind bars, paying for crimes that had devastated dozens of families across multiple states and countries. The judge's words during sentencing had echoed in my mind for weeks afterward. Mr. Walsh, this court has reviewed extensive evidence of systematic financial predation targeting elderly and vulnerable Americans. The defendant exploited the trust and love of people who welcomed him into their families, then used their kindness as a weapon against them. This sentence reflects not only punishment for past crimes, but protection for future potential victims. But more satisfying than Gerald's imprisonment was the transformation that had occurred in my own life and community during the months since his arrest. The house had been restored to a condition that would have made my mother proud, with improvements that honored her memory while creating space for new growth and possibilities. Sarah and I had announced our engagement in the same living room where my mother used to host Christmas dinners and birthday celebrations. The ring had belonged to my grandmother, passed down through 3 generations of women who understood that true wealth comes from love and commitment rather than material possessions. We planned to marry the following autumn in the back garden where my mother had taught me to plant tomatoes and appreciate the patience required for things to grow properly. Dorothy Martinez had agreed to officiate the ceremony, having become ordained online specifically for the occasion, and my entire construction crew would serve as groomsmen in a celebration that honored both family tradition and the friendships forged through adversity. But perhaps the most meaningful development had been the establishment of the Emma Walsh Foundation for Elder Protection, a nonprofit organization dedicated to helping older adults avoid financial fraud and exploitation. Using recovered funds from Gerald's criminal activities, along with donations from grateful families whose relatives had been victimized by similar schemes, the foundation provided education, legal assistance, and advocacy services throughout our region. Dorothy had agreed to serve as the foundation's first board president, bringing her decades of community involvement and her passionate commitment to protecting vulnerable neighbors from predators like Gerald. Her kitchen had become our unofficial headquarters, where we planned outreach events and coordinated with law enforcement agencies to identify and prevent elder abuse situations. The Foundation's first major initiative was a community education program that taught older adults and their families how to recognize and resist financial manipulation tactics. We partnered with local banks attorneys and healthcare providers to create a network of professionals trained to identify potential exploitation situations before they resulted in devastating losses. My construction business had expanded significantly as word spread about my reputation for integrity and my commitment to fair dealing with customers. The publicity surrounding Gerald's prosecution had brought dozens of new clients who wanted to work with someone they could trust completely with their homes and financial investments. Jake had been promoted to partner in the business, and we had hired 3 additional crew members to handle the increased demand for our services. More importantly, we had established a policy of providing free home repairs and maintenance for elderly homeowners who couldn't afford professional services, ensuring that my mother's values of community service continued through the work that bore her memory. Tommy had started a scholarship program in my mother's name at the local community college, providing financial assistance for young people pursuing careers in the construction trades. The first recipient was Maria Santos, a 19-year-old single mother who dreamed of becoming an electrician but couldn't afford the training program costs. During the scholarship presentation ceremony, I spoke about my mother's belief that education and hard work could overcome any obstacle, and that helping others achieve their dreams was the highest form of success anyone could attain. The house itself had become a symbol of resilience and community support rather than just personal loss. We hosted monthly neighborhood gatherings where families shared meals and stories, creating the kind of connected community that my mother had always envisioned. The guest bedroom had been converted into a resource center where older adults could access information about financial planning, legal protections, and healthcare advocacy. Rebecca Sullivan had provided materials from her federal task force, helping us create educational programs that could prevent other families from experiencing the kind of exploitation that Gerald had inflicted on mine. But the most profound healing had occurred during my regular visits to my mother's grave, where I shared updates about the Foundation's work and the positive changes that had emerged from the darkness of Gerald's betrayal. Standing beside her headstone, I no longer felt the crushing weight of grief and injustice that had defined the months immediately following her death. Instead, I felt the quiet satisfaction that comes from honoring someone's memory through actions rather than words, from transforming personal pain into community service, and from building something lasting and meaningful from the wreckage of criminal destruction. Sarah often accompanied me on these visits, and we talked about the kind of marriage and family we wanted to create in the house, where my mother had raised me with such love and wisdom. We discussed names for the children we hoped to have someday, and how we would teach them the values of integrity, compassion, and resilience that had sustained me through the darkest period of my life. The final legal resolution had come when Gerald's assets were completely liquidated and distributed among his victims according to a federal restitution plan. Every family that had suffered losses due to his crimes received compensation, and several expressed interest in supporting the Emma Walsh Foundation's mission to prevent future exploitation. One particularly moving letter came from Mrs. Henderson in Oregon, whose late husband had been victimized by Gerald using methods identical to those he had employed against my mother. She wrote Brian, "Your courage. In pursuing justice, has given our family closure that we never thought possible. Knowing that the man who stole our father's legacy will spend his remaining years in prison allows us to focus on honoring Dad's memory rather than dwelling on the injustice of his death. As I reflected on the journey from that devastating day when I discovered the sold sign in my front yard to this moment of peace and purpose, I realized that my mother's final gift to me hadn't been the house or the money that Gerald had tried to steal. Her true inheritance was the strength to stand up for what was right, the wisdom to seek help when I needed it, and the understanding that justice delayed is not justice denied. The Emma Walsh Foundation had already prevented 3 potential elder abuse situations through early intervention and community education. Dorothy's network of neighborhood watchers had identified suspicious activities targeting vulnerable homeowners, and law enforcement agencies had successfully prosecuted 2 additional financial predators using methods we had helped develop. Most importantly, I had learned that healing doesn't require forgetting the past or pretending that injustice never occurred. True healing comes from transforming pain into purpose, from using personal experience to serve others, and from building communities strong enough to protect their most vulnerable members from those who would exploit kindness as weakness. Gerald had taught me an unexpected lesson about the difference between intelligence and wisdom. He was intelligent enough to construct elaborate criminal schemes and manipulate sophisticated financial systems, but he lacked the wisdom to understand that sustainable success comes from building rather than stealing, from earning trust rather than exploiting it. My mother had possessed that wisdom in abundance, and she had passed it on to me through her example and her love. Standing in her house surrounded by friends and community members whose lives had been enriched by the foundation created in her memory, I finally understood what she had been trying to teach me all along. True wealth isn't measured by the size of your bank account or the value of your possessions. It's measured by the positive impact you have on other people's lives, by the trust and respect you earn through consistent integrity, and by the legacy of service and compassion you leave for future generations to build upon. Gerald had spent decades accumulating money through theft and deception, only to lose everything and face the remainder of his life in federal prison. I had lost my inheritance temporarily, but gained something far more valuable, a purpose that gave meaning to every day, and a community of people committed to protecting others from predators like him. The Emma Walsh Foundation would continue growing and serving families throughout our region, ensuring that my mother's values of kindness and protection would outlive both Gerald's crimes and my own lifetime. Her memory would be honored not through monuments or ceremonies, but through the practical work of preventing other families from experiencing the devastation that Gerald had tried to inflict on mine. As Sarah and I prepared dinner in the kitchen, where my mother had taught me to cook and appreciate the simple pleasures of family life, I felt grateful for every difficult lesson this experience had provided. I had learned to ask for help when I needed it, to trust in the goodness of people who offer assistance without expecting anything in return, and to believe that persistence and patience can overcome even sophisticated criminal schemes. But most importantly, I had learned that justice isn't just about punishment for wrongdoing. True justice involves restoration, healing, and the creation of stronger communities that can prevent future victims from suffering needlessly. Gerald's European vacation had cost him his freedom and his future, but it had given me something infinitely more valuable: the knowledge that good people working together can overcome any challenge, and that love and integrity are forces more powerful than greed and deception. The house that Gerald had tried to steal had become a symbol of everything he could never understand or possess: genuine community, lasting relationships, and the kind of wealth that grows stronger when it's shared rather than hoarded. Have you ever had to fight for something that was rightfully yours? Or witnessed someone close to you being taken advantage of by people they trusted? The experience of standing up to injustice can be terrifying and exhausting, but it's also one of the most important things we can do for ourselves and our communities. I'd love to hear your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please consider liking and subscribing to support more content about real-life challenges and the courage it takes to overcome them. Sharing these stories helps build awareness about elder abuse and financial exploitation, potentially protecting other families from experiencing similar betrayals. Thank you for taking this journey with me, and remember that no matter how dark things might seem, there are always people willing to help, and justice is always worth fighting for. Take care of yourselves and the people you love, and never be afraid to ask for help when you need it most.